Hello? Today we dive into the world of Dexter, the most famous serial killer who, despite his brutality, fights crime in his own unique way. Behind his precision and cold-blooded nature lie mistakes that could have been fatal to his secrecy. Let's analyze the moments in Dexter's life that worked against him and became his vulnerabilities. Mistake hash 1. Ignoring traces. Dexter always carefully planned his murders. His methods were impeccable and he made sure not to leave any evidence behind. However, like any human, he had moments when he overlooked crucial details. Despite meticulously cleaning crime scenes, there were times when he failed to notice small things that could have led to his exposure. One of the earliest examples can be found in the first season when Dexter, attempting to cover up a murder, didn't eliminate all the traces as perfectly as he should have. For instance, bloodstains on his clothes could have been found during an investigation and led to unexpected consequences. These mistakes wouldn't have been critical for an ordinary person, but for Dexter, they could have marked the beginning of the end. His approach to hiding evidence wasn't always flawless. Sometimes, in his haste to erase all traces, he failed to consider every possible detail. Even a tiny mistake, such as a forgotten piece of fabric, bloodstains on his shoes, or a barely noticeable fingerprint, could put him in a difficult position. These details might not always be obvious, but an experienced investigator could pick up on them. Mistake hash 2. Emotional involvement. Dexter always believed that his ability to suppress emotions was his greatest weapon. He tried to remain cold and distant from those around him to avoid falling into the trap of his own humanity. But as we know, emotions always play a role in a person's life. Despite his efforts to be completely devoid of feelings, his attachments became his weak spots. A clear example of this is his relationship with Rita. He initially entered the relationship as a cover, attempting to create the illusion of a normal life. However, despite his efforts, he began to develop real feelings. This was a mistake. His attachment to Rita and her children became more and more evident. He lost his cold precision and professionalism, which could have had serious consequences throughout the story. It became increasingly difficult for him to hide his vulnerability when it came to people who mattered to him. Even emotions like attachment or compassion could throw him off balance, making him more susceptible to being exposed. Additionally, his emotional involvement is evident in his relationship with his sister Deborah. At some point, Dexter starts depending on her presence in his life, which weakens his defensive mechanisms. He begins to show emotions toward her, ultimately putting his secrecy at risk. Deborah, despite her love for her brother, grows more suspicious, and her intuition starts telling her that something is off about Dexter. Mistake hash 3. A risky lifestyle. Despite his professionalism, Dexter sometimes took excessive risks. Even though he had a carefully structured plan, his life became more and more exposed. The more he interacted with his colleagues, the more dangerous it became. The more he opened up to them, the higher the chances of being discovered. One of the most striking examples is his behavior with La Guerta. He begins spending more time with her, sometimes even engaging in conversations that could be dangerous. Couldn't immediately expose him. Her suspicions could have been a crucial step toward his downfall. Additionally, his work as a forensic expert kept him in the spotlight. Dexter's job as a forensic specialist in the police force constantly kept him in the public eye. Although he tried to cover his tracks, working with homicides and investigations put him in situations where his own methods could be questioned. In such conditions, every move he made was under scrutiny, and even the smallest mistake could be noticed. Dexter himself created the perfect conditions for risk by playing this dangerous double game. Mistake hash 4. Underestimating the threat from close people. One of Dexter's biggest mistakes was underestimating the threat posed by those closest to him. His relationship with his sister Deborah is a prime example of how he put himself in danger. Deborah, being an intelligent and persistent woman, gradually began to sense that something was wrong. Dexter tried to keep his secrets, but his behavior became increasingly suspicious to her. He always believed he could control the situation, but even the most well-thought-out plan doesn't always hold up under pressure. Other characters, such as Laguerta and his colleagues, also became entangled in his world, and Dexter wasn't always prepared for the possibility that one of them might start digging into his past. His life wasn't just about battling criminals, it was also about evading those and closest to him, people who might suspect his true nature. Ignoring this fact turned out to be a serious mistake. Mistake #5. Blindness to his own mistakes. Like any human, Dexter made mistakes, but he often ignored them. His confidence in himself and his ability to control everything around him became his weakness. He started relying too much on his experience and intuition, forgetting that even the most calculated individual is not immune to failure. In the later seasons, he began placing too much trust in those close to him, which became one of his biggest errors. His attachments to people, his dependence on their presence in his life slowly eroded his defense mechanisms. His emotional involvement with Rita, Deborah, and others no longer allowed him to be as fearless as he once was. His decisions became increasingly influenced by others, and as a result, those decisions became more and more dangerous. Mistake #6. Excessive confidence. Dexter became overly confident in his abilities. Over time, his self-assurance grew, and this became his weakness. When a person starts feeling invincible, they begin making mistakes. This was evident in how Dexter started neglecting the need to cover his tracks as carefully or act with extreme caution. He believed he could always avoid exposure, but this false sense of security made him vulnerable. His overconfidence was especially noticeable in the later seasons when he started losing control over his life and actions. The deeper he played this game, the more he risked. Mistake #7. Vulnerability through his victims. Although Dexter followed a strict code and only killed those who deserved it, his victims became increasingly complex and entangled. At some point, he became too emotionally invested in their stories. His attachment to them, sometimes even sympathy, became a critical mistake. These feelings could make him careless. For example, his interactions with his later victims, such as Lila, became personal, which significantly increased the risk of exposure. His emotional involvement in the lives of those he killed not only led to personal struggles, but also subconscious mistakes in his work. Even a serial killer can falter when he starts believing there is more between him and his victims than just hunter and prey. Mistake #8. Neglecting his own needs. Dexter gradually forgot about his own desires and personal needs. His life and his code became his sole focus, limiting his personal freedom. He constantly played the role of the perfect family man, maintaining the illusion of normalcy, but over time, this started to destroy him. He couldn't allow himself to be weak. He couldn't show his humanity. This emotional suppression and constant pressure took a toll on his mental state. When a person doesn't take care of themselves, their decisions become riskier. Dexter sacrificed his well-being for his mission, and this mistake proved fatal, as he ultimately couldn't handle the weight of it all. Although Dexter was an experienced killer, his problems began when he had to deal with other murderers. For example, his encounters with killers like Jordan Chase or the Doomsday Killer put him to the test. He didn't always assess their behavior and capabilities correctly. The mere existence of other serial killers who had their own motives and rules increased the likelihood of Dexter being exposed. At times, he overestimated his ability to be the only one in control of the situation. However, when facing people just as dangerous as himself, Dexter made missteps, failing to always stay one step ahead. Mistake #10. Overloading his life with responsibilities. Dexter constantly overloaded himself with responsibilities. His job at the police department, maintaining a family life, constant interactions with colleagues, and his personal mission to rid the world of criminals. All of this created immense pressure. He tried to manage everything at once, which put his personal safety at risk. He couldn't afford to take a break, couldn't relax, and couldn't focus entirely on his mission. The many commitments and problems he faced prevented him from staying at the top of his game. This overload was one of the reasons why, in the end, he couldn't cope with the consequences of his actions. Mistake #11. Keeping too many secrets. One of Dexter's core principles was to hide his true identity. However, maintaining so many secrets became a heavy burden. Too many people either knew or had the potential to discover his dark side. His colleagues, his family, and even criminals. Dexter constantly had to uphold facades and lies to ensure his safety. Managing this intricate web of deception became dangerous, as any small slip in his behavior could lead to exposure. Whenever he forgot a minor detail or failed to monitor every aspect of his double life, the risks increased. At some point, all these secrets simply became unbearable. Mistake #12. Lack of professional support. Dexter often relied solely on himself. While he was highly intelligent and capable, the lack of professional help or guidance from other experts, such as psychologists or forensic specialists, affected his decisions. When he faced difficult situations, especially when dealing with other serial killers, he lacked consultations and external analysis that could have helped him make better choices. His overconfidence in his ability to handle every mistake. #13. Neglecting human relationships. Despite his life being filled with murder and dark secrets, Dexter still attempted to build relationships with those around him. However, these relationships, whether with Rita, Deborah, or his colleagues, often became sources of his mistakes. He frequently tried to maintain personal connections with people who could neither understand nor accept his dark side. His desire to hold on to these relationships with those who could become his vulnerabilities ultimately worked against him. His personal ties became entry points for suspicion, increasing the likelihood of his exposure. Mistake #14. Underestimating his own psychological consequences. Dexter constantly denied that his actions, killing, could leave psychological scars. At some point, he began to see his activities as merely doing his job, strictly following his code. However, the psychology of a killer is not as simple as it might seem. Over time, Dexter began to experience inner conflicts, guilt, and self-hatred, which manifested in his actions. He underestimated the psycho-emotional toll of his deeds. His unresolved psychological issues started affecting his behavior and interactions with others, adding extra risk as his instability could surface in unexpected situations. Mistake #15. Deviating from his own moral code. Dexter always adhered to a strict moral code, never killing innocent people and ensuring justice. However, over time, this code began to shift. Occasionally, he justified his actions based on personal emotions or circumstances. For example, in his relationship with Lila, he started acting more impulsively, breaking his own rules. This was dangerous because it indicated that he was becoming less objective and disciplined. He began rationalizing his mistakes, which slowly eroded the very code that had kept him in control. Mistake #16. Overcommitting to personal relationships. Dexter believed that maintaining close relationships was a way to preserve his humanity. He formed a relationship with Rita, tried to be a good father to her children, and built a family, hoping for stability. But this choice turned out to be a mistake, no matter how much he tried. To live like a normal person, his bond with Rita and her children constantly put him in dangerous situations. Not only did it increase the likelihood of his exposure, but it also put their lives at risk. Mistake #17. Neglecting his own safety. Over time, Dexter became careless about his own safety. He started leaving behind important evidence without considering the consequences, making himself vulnerable. He believed that everything in his life was under perfect control, but in reality, it wasn't. In the later seasons, his safety became less of a priority. For example, his reckless decisions regarding certain people, underestimating the threats they posed, often played a decisive role in his failures. Mistake hash 18. Over-reliance on his methods. At some point, Dexter became too dependent on his usual methods. He always followed his rigid code and executed his killings according to a specific algorithm. This became his mistake because such strict patterns made him predictable. His enemies could adapt to his methods and use them against him. On several occasions, he encountered killers who understood exactly how he operated and attempted to turn his own habits against him. Mistake hash 19. Underestimating his emotional connection with Deborah. Deborah was one of the most important people in Dexter's life. He not only considered her his sister, but also felt a deep emotional attachment to her. Despite this, Dexter underestimated how much their relationship could affect his life. His decision to hide his true nature from her, despite their closeness, was not only dangerous for his own safety but also for hers. When Deborah started to suspect that something was wrong with her brother, it put Dexter in an extremely vulnerable position. Underestimating the strength of this emotional connection and his lack of openness could have led to a major exposure. Mistake hash 20. Overloading himself with justice as justification. Dexter often used his code as a justification for his killings, emphasizing that he only punished those who truly deserved it. However, as he continued following his code, he became increasingly selective about whom he considered deserving. This led to his own concept of justice becoming distorted. He began justifying more questionable killings, which disrupted the balance he had once set for himself. He became less objective, creating an internal conflict that others could potentially notice. Mistake hash 21. Lying to himself. Dexter was used to lying to those around him, but one of his biggest mistakes was that he started lying to himself. He convinced himself that his actions were justified, that he was a good person despite being a serial killer. At some point, this lie became so deeply embedded in his consciousness that he truly believed in his own righteousness. This self-deception could have backfired, making him lose touch with reality, something that became dangerous not only for him but also for those around him. Mistake hash 22. Expecting everything to stay under control. Dexter was used to controlling every aspect of his life, and he made the mistake of thinking he could always keep everything in check. Throughout the series, he encountered situations where his composure and calculated approach couldn't prevent unpredictable events. For example, unexpected intrusions into his life, such as Rita's death or other external threats, proved that reality is too unpredictable to rely on strict control. And when things spiraled beyond his control, he found himself in danger. Mistake hash 23. Neglecting the victims in his life. Although Dexter tried to follow his code and only kill criminals, he also started forgetting that some of his actions could impact innocent people. For example, his lack of caution regarding accidental witnesses or the people he killed became a mistake. He could overlook small details that later put his loved ones in danger. In his pursuit of justice, he began simplifying his decisions and disregarding potential consequences. Mistake hash 24. Failing to consider the consequences of long-term loneliness. Dexter lived alone for a long time, hiding his dark side from everyone. However, this prolonged isolation began taking a toll on him. He sought close relationships with people, but struggled to interact with them properly due to his isolation. Ultimately, his desire to appear normal while pretending he had no dark side led to psychological issues. His loneliness became a mistake because he couldn't build proper relationships while simultaneously hiding his true self. Mistake hash 25. Ignoring new threats. At the start of his career as a serial killer, Dexter was cautious and meticulously analyzed every threat. However, as the story progressed, he began neglecting new threats, assuming he could always handle them. Underestimating new risks and threats from others, such as his colleagues or new enemies, became one of his critical mistakes. Mistake #26. Lack of long-term planning. Throughout his life, Dexter largely operated based on circumstances. Despite his precise calculations and well-thought-out steps, he did not always consider how events would unfold in the long run. He failed to anticipate what would happen if his life spiraled out of control. As a result, there were moments when he found himself unprepared for unexpected consequences. His inability to assess all possible long-term threats to his life became one of his key mistakes. Well, friends, we've gone through the mistakes of Dexter that could have led to his downfall. His journey was not an easy one, and despite all his skills, his quest for justice, and his desire to help people, his weaknesses and mistakes ultimately played their part. Perhaps if he had considered some of these points, his life would have turned out differently. Remember that every character, even someone like Dexter, has their vulnerabilities that can lead to mistakes. This is what makes such stories interesting. They show that even strong personalities are not perfect. If you enjoyed this analysis, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any new videos. Together, we will always look for new aspects in these stories, discuss mistakes, and explore what could have been done differently. Thank you for your attention, and see you in the next video.